I'm Matthew Dank, and this is Service and Beyond podcast, where we talk to Australian military veterans about their service stories and their journeys out of uniform and back to civilian life. How do you approach building credibility in a new professional role or choosing where to invest your time and effort to get ahead? What is the most important trait to have to get through setbacks and hurdles when undergoing career transition? And how do you grow the abilities of your team while engendering trust and investing in your team's performance, not just now, but for the future? We address these questions and more in today's episode with Cliff Morgan, organisational psychologist and director of Lumian Consulting. Hello and welcome back to Service and Beyond podcast for 2023, where we continue to focus on the often difficult journey from military back to civilian life and building careers after defence. Today's episode features Clifford Morgan, organisational psychologist, and someone I first came across back in 2017 when I was flying the mighty C-17 Globemaster at 36th Squadron, and Cliff was rendering services in coaching and leadership development to the Air Force. This episode I really enjoyed for a number of reasons, including that Cliff himself made the transition from NCO or enlisted ranks through to psychologist, then delivering training and leadership coaching services to leaders throughout organisations at all levels. So he's really traverse the spectrum. He's got some really interesting insights on building credibility and expertise early in one's career and on turning up day in, day out as the number one quality to bring to the table to build success over a long period of time. The other piece I really like that he touched on is the quality of leadership that we have in defence that we often take for granted. The skills in planning and execution and management that everyone in defence has and often takes for granted, and the fact that that isn't always the case outside of the Defence Force. So the importance of recognising this, playing to this strength, and making sure we articulate that when going forward after the military. Okay, let's get into the episode. Our guest today combines his military experience with his psychological expertise to help leaders close the gap between intent and impact. He has served with the Royal Australian Air Force for over 17 years and is now an endorsed organisational psychologist. With years of service, leading and coaching people, both in uniform and out, he brings a wealth of experience that provides a unique perspective to assist his clients. As a coach, he has worked with CEOs, military commanders, government executives, and business and community leaders across a wide variety of industries, and he's also the author of the book, The Coaching Leader, Essential Skills to Enhance Your Leadership and Develop Your People Every Day. Clifford Morgan, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Matt. It's great to be here. Thanks for the opportunity to come and have a chat.
Very welcome, mate. Very welcome. And great to talk about your Air Force background and history and, of course, what you're doing now in the leadership development space. So let's start out with your experience in Air Force and your career, where it began and where it commenced.
Yeah, so I spent a number of years in the Air Force, as you mentioned there. First of all, as what we call an airfield defence guard, for those of you your listeners who aren't familiar with what that is. Basically, it's infantry skill set, but defending air bases. And I, as I mentioned, was in there for a number of years, was trained as a patrol commander and a weapons instructor, and essentially was loving my time there. But it came a point where I decided that it was never going to be a long-term thing for me, and so I figured I was up for promotion and posting, still absolutely loving the work, but I knew the longer I stayed in, the harder it would be for me to get out and do something else, which was always my intention. So rather than starting to be posted around the country, I bit the bullet and put the discharge in. But and then once I kind of became a psychologist post that initial involvement with the Air Force, I commissioned as a specialist reserve psychologist. So now when I put the uniform on, it's as an officer, it's as a psychologist, and I'm doing a very different type role than what I was all those years ago when I started.
Indeed, mate. Yeah, I can't say I've come across many ADGs that have switched over to psychology. What brought you to that career pivot and decision? It's quite a substantial one.
Look, it's really a funny story, Matt, in that the truth of the matter is I didn't have anything else better to do. And it sounds a bit funny, but my dad, when I left high school, he encouraged me to become a psychologist. He'd sat in some training with, funnily enough, an ex-army psychologist who is now a consultant. And in that session, my dad was like, Cliff would be brilliant at that. He should become a psychologist. And at the time, I kind of young and a bit impetuous, and I said, no, I'll never do that. The only people that become psychologists are those that are so broken they want to learn how to fix themselves by learning how to fix other people. And I still maintain there's a few people in the profession for that reason. But yeah, when it came time to discharge, and I actually didn't know what I was going to do. It's one of those things. I'm sure we'll talk about it later. In your transition, I say always have a plan, but I didn't have a plan when I discharged. And my dad suggested, well, why don't you try psychology? And literally, I had nothing else better to do, and I thought, well, I'll give it a crack. And never looked back. From day one, absolutely loved it. Always been interested in, what makes people tick, and the leadership side of things, and the psychology of leadership. And so, yeah, I started on that path, even though it wasn't a very intentional, I'm going to leave defence and go down here. And as I say, I've never looked back. It's been a great journey.
So a pretty major pivot and quite a lot of study required on your behalf. How did you come to that decision in your career? You mentioned earlier it was a decision of, getting out, doing something different, or potentially, being posted and continuing with your career for a number of years. How did you identify the need to make that decision, and how did you come to it?
Well, I think it really started, Matt, when I went into defence. So I went into defence knowing that it was not going to be a 30-year career for me. And so that's a pretty different mindset to someone who just joins defence and let's see how it goes, right? So, initially when I did join the Air Force, it was only going to be for 12 months. I was going to take a break from uni. I was originally studying to be a high school history and drama teacher, which is kind of another extreme on the spectrum. And I was only going to take 12 months and it was part of the Ready Reserve scheme for those that know that scheme back in the day, and do 12 months full-time training and then stay on as a reservist, and I'd go back to uni and complete my studies. And I just never went back to uni. I just stayed. I loved it so much and really enjoyed it. But as I said, it was really that posting cycle that really kind of, it was just a natural milestone, I guess, in my career, where I said, okay, do I want to keep doing this, or do I want to get out and do something else, which was always my intention. And as I said, for me, it was very much the longer I stay in, as much as I'm loving it, the harder it's going to be to get out and do something else, whatever that something is, recognizing that I will be starting essentially from scratch again. One of the reasons why I liked the idea of becoming an ADG, apart from the content of the role, was there wasn't really a natural equivalent, I guess, in civilian space. So I'd grown up hearing about. I've got a grandfather, 2 uncles, 3 cousins, and a brother who are all pilots. So, and when I was young, I wanted to be a fighter pilot as well. So aviation and that sort of thing, the industry is in my blood. And I've grown up hearing stories about, the fighter pilots who were at the top of their game leaving and going and joining the airlines and not cutting it because it was just not exciting. They'd been doing kind of the best, the top flying that you could do in the world. And they come here and they're, pressing buttons and kind of driving a bus, right? And starting at the bottom of the hierarchy. And I didn't want that to happen to me. I don't want to, invest in building a career and a skill set in a particular area and then go into the civilian world and just kind of be completely bored and not being able to, enjoy my work. So I wanted to do something completely different, which is part of the attraction to, the ADG mustering in the first place. So I was starting from scratch, really, again, and I knew that likely I was probably going to have to do a bunch of study, and I didn't want to, kind of do that while I had a family. Not that I had a family when I made that transition, but I wanted to kind of get the foundations of that new career, whatever it was going to be, under my belt before I had a whole bunch of responsibilities and financial commitments and all that sort of thing. So, it was a little bit of a tough decision to make. As I said, I really enjoyed it. Essentially I took it was about 40, 50 grand pay cut per year to go back to uni. And obviously, and I had a house at that point in time and a mortgage, and there's a whole lot of commitments there to make and manage. But yeah, that's kind of I guess the thinking and the mindset and some of the key motivations for me to make that decision to transition out of defence.
How did you go changing gears in terms of your core skills, your mindset, and the crowd you were amongst? Obviously, ADGs, similar to Army Infantry, combat focused, very physical, very much a core domain of the Defence Force, into psychology, coaching, leadership development, working with leaders and organisations across all levels. So really, for an enlisted person, probably quite a substantial change in focus and skills.
Yeah, in many ways it was. I remember when I first started out coaching, and I had my psychology degree under my belt, and I was, as a reservist, I was still an enlisted ADG, and ended up coaching a group captain in the Air Force, and so there was a massive kind of rank disparity there, and obviously experience disparity. But it was so it was different, and you've got to kind of think about things, but a lot of the principles are the same. They're just applied in a very different way at a different level. And a lot of what that group captain was going through were the same things that, I myself as a patrol commander and a lot of the other leaders at that level were going through. It was just bigger, right? They're not dealing with a team of 10, or they're dealing with, hundreds of people and millions of dollars and all that sort of thing. So, but the principles, the challenges are the same. And so therefore often the process of working through that is very similar. And so that was, I guess, a big realization and lesson for me. And, I also had a lot of other kind of complementary knowledge and skill set and expertise based on my studies and that sort of thing that I could bring and inform that. But, I think that answers the question.
Yeah, indeed. Is there anything you think in particular that you've carried across from your skills base that sort of stood you apart from your peers and your colleagues in the psychological space, like being under significant pressure, combat experience, combat training, the operational tempo, and being able to work under that pressure very concisely to targets? Has any of that really paid dividends for you, and can you put your finger on anything that carries forward to this day?
Very, very much so. I think wherever you are in your career, you're going to encounter difficulty and challenge, and whether that's as a team member internally in an organisation, as a leader, whether that's running your own business like I am now, in whatever way, you're going to encounter a large degree of challenge, and you get very much used to that. In the military, you're always put in challenging scenarios. That's what a military exercise is, or an operation is, where you're encountering that all the time, and you're training to overcome those. Yes, you're training to do a job, but you don't just get put in a job where you've got an easy scenario. You get put in a job where a challenging scenario. So you develop this mindset where and people have different mechanisms to cope with those challenges. And for me, it was just keep turning up. If it's one more step. All right, let's just keep going. If you're on a 25K pack march, you got 30 kilos on your back, and that becomes really challenging around the 18K mark, right? And so for me, it's the one more step, right? And when I think about when I started my business, and obviously there's a whole lot of challenges in doing that. And for me, it was just keep turning up, one more day, one more step. And it was that same mechanism that I used to overcome the challenges, the physical challenges, that I essentially just switched to overcome the mental and the business challenges that I was facing at that point in time. So I think the ability to cope with pressure and the mechanisms that you develop to overcome the challenges in the military that you're placed in, even if you never do operations, right? There's a whole lot of challenging stuff, just in day-to-day stuff in barracks. But those mechanisms and the discipline, the consistency, all that sort of thing, and just the way of thinking. Well, if we've got to achieve this mission, this goal, or we've got to do X, Y, and Z, and so this kind of intuitive planning thought process that you often develop, right from early NCO all the way through, is super valuable. And it's one of those. I always say that when veterans come out of defence, many struggle because they say, well, I don't have all these things. And there's this big focus on transferable skills. And I think many veterans can't articulate the transferable skills that they have. And that planning one is a key one that is absolutely invaluable. And, it's just part of ingrained in the way that you think, okay, if we have to do this and we've got to do that and that and that, and we've got to, give these set of orders, we've got to think about these logistics and these, command and control and all those, just follow the SMEAC process. And that's just natural to you. And you have your specific tasks and your implied tasks. That's not a normal way of thinking in the civilian world. And so that for a manager to have someone that thinks like that on their team is absolutely gold. But a lot of veterans don't think that that's, they just think that that's nothing different, right? And so therefore it's nothing that they promote when they're applying for jobs or they see as a value add to a team. So there's some of the things that I think really stood me in good stead. And obviously there's a whole bunch of them that are there, but there's some of the key ones that come to mind.
I think it's interesting you zoned in on the inability to articulate the skills that we carry with us from our defence careers. And as I think about that, and as I've thought for the last few months on the topic, a lot of these are acquired fairly early in the career. They're part of quite intensive training programs that anyone stepping into that realm, that military realm from the civilian world, is going to find that a major challenge. But once those skills are consolidated, they're just part of who we are, and then common across the defence community. So it's hard to identify and put your finger on those things. I think it's a great point.
Yeah, when it's normal, you don't see that it's anything special. It's really only when you step out, and that's when you realise that, hey, it's in this particular context, in the civilian context, it's not normal, and it can be absolutely a real value. And we talked about planning there. There's a whole bunch of those things that are just kind of normal everyday parts of military life that are really valuable in the civilian context because they're not normal.
So soon after you finished your psychology training and started counselling, you had some pretty interesting experiences at Manus Island, Nauru, immigration detention. Quite interesting, really combining, I guess, some operational footing in terms of the people there dealing with that environment and also your psychological training. How was that environment? How did you find that as an early stage experience in your psychology career?
Yeah, really valuable. So definitely there was a type of psychology that I didn't want to be doing long term. Really interesting. So I in those environments, what I was doing was providing essentially mental health support to the security elements that were in the detention centres and over in Manus Island, Nauru. And I'm an organisational psychologist by trade and training, and that's where I've specialised in the application of psychology within organisations, the workplace, and helping leaders get the most out of their people and helping people get the most out of their work. Right, so that's kind of where my expertise is. That's where my interest and my passion lies. But early on in my career, I knew that it was super important that I needed to get a breadth of experience, and I needed to be able to counsel and counsel well. Even though it's not what I wanted to do, I knew that just because I had the title of psychologist, there are certain expectations that everyone I would encounter, every client that I would encounter in the future would expect of me. And one of those was to do the basics of mental health and do the basics of counselling, even if I wasn't a specialist clinical psychologist. So early on, I said yes to a lot of opportunities that will give me that broad skill set and basic. I spent 12 months on the phones at Lifeline, just volunteering, and that was where I really cut my teeth in terms of that. But then when I went over to Manus Island and Nauru, for me, it was I quite enjoyed it. There was a lot of parallels. Yes, it was FIFO, but it was very similar to some of the conditions, I guess, that I experienced on deployment in Baghdad and Iraq, and so that was kind of nothing new to me. A lot of the personnel that I was dealing with, the security staff there, were ex-defense, so I was able to relate to them in a way that most of the other psychologists couldn't, and make them feel comfortable and all that sort of thing. And I get what they're saying and why they're saying it and all of those sorts of things. So great experience, and I think that's I guess another takeaway for someone that's starting new in a career. Don't always just aim for where you want to be in 10 years' time. Get the breadth of experience in that field first. Say yes to whatever opportunities come first, and then over time you niche and develop your expertise to exactly where you want to go. I found that really beneficial, and it's one of those, particularly when I'm sort of mentoring, I guess, younger psychologists that are coming through. That's one of the pieces of advice that I give them, but I think it applies not just in psychology. I think that's really relevant. A lot of the clients that I work with, I think about software development clients that I've got at the moment, for those that only have experience in one particular platform or coding language or whatever, they get stuck. They're not versatile, and therefore they can't operate outside of those environments and those characteristics, and they struggle to mentor younger people coming through when they're working on projects that are outside their expertise. So if you've got at least a basic foundation of expertise across the breadth of your industry, I think that becomes a whole lot easier and a whole lot more valuable as a leader in that organisation or workplace or industry.
Yeah, I like it. I think, taking that real methodical approach, which you've obviously done, towards what are those areas of credibility or competence that perhaps you're not personally, passionate or enthusiastic about, but you've gone and done that regardless, looking forward at what an employer wants or the marketplace wants of someone with your background and skills. So probably not a natural way to look at things, but very valuable. Yeah,
but I think, again, right, it's also probably stems from my military time, in that you think about, well, what are the situations and scenarios that I might encounter, and what's the skill set and competence that I need to be able to perform well in those, and let's go get that, right? As an ADG, the stuff that I loved doing was the cool stuff, right? It was the combat survival stuff. It was the airside awareness, the CPP, all that stuff. I didn't really like doing the ambushes or the sitting for hours on end waiting for someone that may or may not come up and do it. But there was very much a role that I could encounter, so we trained for it and we prepared for it. And you go on a mission, you think about developing your actions on, well, what do I have to do here if this turns up? What do I have to do there if that turns up? Are we prepared for that? Let's make sure that we are. And so again, that kind of mindset, it's probably, now that I think about it, I wasn't necessarily intentional about sitting down and go, okay, cool. As a psychologist, what are all the different things that I'm and write it down on a piece of paper and, okay, cool, I'm going to develop a plan to go do that. I'm going to develop. I didn't do that, but it's a mindset, I think, that just automatically, I was very much aware of this might happen. I'm aware that this might happen. Opportunity comes up. Okay, cool. Let's pursue that so I can develop that competence, and it just kind of, happen that way.
So probably an interesting point to pivot onto some other skills you've had to pick up over the last several years, and that's running your own business. So how has this approach assisted you, and what are the key challenges that you've faced and tackled in the last couple of years at Lumian?
Yeah, look, it's running your own business. Look, it's exciting. I absolutely love it. I probably won't work for anyone else for the rest of my life. Um, but it is, as you say, it's challenging. The stats are that 90% of businesses fail in the first 12 months, 2 years, and so the fact that we're now in our 7th year is pretty exciting. We've kind of made got the first lot of hurdles, and we now have sustainable business and doing quite well, which is great. I think one of the keys for me. I guess my journey into business, you'll notice that there's a bit of a theme in that what I often advise people to do is not what I did, and I learned some lessons the hard way. The way I ended up getting into business was when I finished psychology. I had a particular type of consulting that I wanted to do, and the organisations that consulted in that space weren't hiring at that time. And I was essentially going out and buying a lot of established psychologist coffee and saying, just one, building my network. Networking is super important. And getting advice and guidance as to, what are the lessons that you've learned and how can I apply those at my stage of career, and all of that, those conversations was super helpful. And one of those, while I was doing this, I'm applying for new jobs and, anything and everything, just trying to get a gig, which is really interesting when everybody wants, they're either looking for a grad who's, 19 years old and, they can underpay them just to get them a start, or they're looking for 5 years plus experience. And I kind of sat, in the middle there, and I wasn't getting a lot of a look in. So I 80 to 100 applications, applying for job, which is what wasn't getting a gig. And one of those coffees, I had with a psychologist who now is a good friend, and I actually collaborate with on occasion, and still maintain contact. He said, given your background, I think one of my partners might actually have some opportunities for you. And so I went and had coffee with that individual, and he said, look, we can do this for you at the moment. And I went and got an ABN to make the most of a short-term opportunity with him. But that kind of snowballed and turned into something else, and I did something well. And so he gave me another opportunity, and that's what led to the Manus Island and Nauru opportunities that we spoke about. And eventually I was kind of running an EAP program with him, and then getting some additional clients and doing some other consulting and contracting underneath. And all of a sudden, 18 months later, I was still paying my bills, and I'm kind of like, well, let's stop looking for work and let's just give this business thing a run. And so I kind of say that I fell into business rather than starting business with a plan, and projections and business plan and all those sorts of things, which I think is just smart, right? You never go on an operation without having a mission and a plan for success. And so you should never go into business without doing that as well. So that's kind of my journey as to how I've started. But I think the key along the way is, depending on what business you start, you're going to encounter a whole lot of different challenges and obstacles. For me as a psychologist and consulting, that's going to be very different to someone that's starting a product business, or any sort of other business. And yes, there's some key challenges that are the same, but the challenges are going to be different. I think it's that mindset of, I'm just going to keep turning up, right? Just keep turning up. For me, it's like, just turn up the next day. I'm not the smartest person in the room. I'm not the best psychologist out there. I'm actually not the hardest working either. And I recognize that, but I tell you what, I'm persistent, and I'll keep turning up the next day and the next day and the next day. And and again, that's a character trait that was honed in the military. You're on exercise, and it might be raining and terrible and all sorts of stuff. It's just like, just get through to the end of the day, and we'll start again tomorrow. And that kind of mindset, which got me through exercises, deployments, all sorts of things, is very much one that I brought into business. And no matter how challenging it gets, hey, just show up the next day, and we'll get something done. We'll take the next step forward, and then we'll go from there.
I really love that one, Cliff, around persistence, tenacity, and to me, it's compound interest. It's the small increments that over a week, hey, doesn't add up to much. Over 3 weeks, not much. But you add that up over a year, 2 years, 3 years with that relentless drive. Geez, it outpaces a lot of people. It really does build up.
Yeah. There was a quote I read once that I smiled at and really resonates. Is unheroic days and weeks are what heroic years and decades are made of. And it's exactly right. You might keep turning up and you do nothing that's special. But the fact that you keep turning up and you keep being consistent in what you're trying to do and persisting at it, it all adds up. It's the aggregation of marginal gains, and that's where it's when people stop, right? That they fail, or businesses go under, or whatever it is. And if you just persist, that's when the great things of value actually get achieved. So,
indeed, mate, indeed. So you're offering a range of services now at Lumian, including coaching, leadership development. What's your sort of passion and your key focus there in the service offering that you provide?
Yeah, look, so as I said, organisational psychology, psychology in the workplace is really what I'm trained to do. And within that, I specialise, kind of the work that I love doing is the strategy, leaders and team space, right? And so working a lot with leaders to enhance their leadership. I talk about, taking leaders to luminaries, and that's where you can be a leader and you can be a good leader, but a luminary is someone who's absolutely brilliant in their field. And so they stand out. They're someone of great achievement and prominence. And yes, that means that they can execute and they do really good work. They're high performers. But what makes them, there's a lot of high performers, right? And, so luminaries are those people that stand out above that. So what is that? And really, they do it well. They elevate other people. You think about all the luminaries throughout history, whether or not you're talking about people like Nelson Mandela and Gandhi or Einstein, or those people that they refer to as luminaries. They're always focused on other people and helping them do more. And I think when you think about some of those, or a lot of those luminaries, they actually want others to actually do what they couldn't do. It's standing on the shoulders of giants. And so I talk to or help leaders kind of transition just from focusing on them leading well. Yes, I help them do that, but then once they're doing that and they're performing well, it's the focus shifts to how do you elevate others, and how do you take the lessons that you have learned and the principles that define your leadership, and how do you communicate that out so other people can apply those. And I talk about this exponential influence. So whenever I'm coaching you as a leader, then I'm not just working with you, I'm looking through you to your team. And yes, I will be kind of equipping you to be the best leader that you can, but I'll be challenging you to take what you're learning and communicating that to your team and equipping and empowering them so that they can go and do that to the teams that they lead. And so that vision of creating great leaders who create great leaders who go and do the same. And it's this exponential influence and leadership is what I'm passionate about. So that obviously happens in, an individual executive coaching context. I also work with a lot of leadership teams to do that. And so we talk about what's the difference between a functioning team, a performing team, a high-performing team, And then I talk about the luminary team. As a team, both within your organisation, so you have other teams coming to you, say, hey, you're also doing things really well. How do you do that? Can we replicate that in our team? And then I challenge them to go beyond the organisation and say, how can you essentially not just be luminaries within your organisation, but within your industry? And that really starts, the organisation starts to really stand out and become a bit of a luminary itself. When other organisations are looking to you to emulate and replicate. And that's really powerful. So, and then you work with leaders around the strategy behind that concept as well. And so, it might be, if I'm working with, an executive, it might be taking the organizational strategy and how do I, we break that down and implement in your department. But then how do we go about those strategic initiatives in a way that creates the exponential influence is a really great question, a great conversation to wrestle with. So as I say, strategy leaders, teams, we do training on a lot of psychology stuff, but that's the kind of philosophy, whether it's well-being, whether it's, performance and execution, whether it's, goal setting and all sorts of different things. That's the philosophy that underpins whether I'm working one-on-one, whether I'm working with a team, whether I'm kind of working across an organization. There's a whole lot of, psychological assessments and different things that we use to facilitate all of that as well. But that's kind of what my business offers.
I imagine there's a huge appetite for that, Cliff, out there in the marketplace, because that's where organisations clearly want to go, the leaders that build and empower the next generation and their people to perform. Really interesting article I came across on your website around the tyranny of urgent. And as you know, busy people, either leaders or team members, often fixate on the squeaky wheel, the loudest thing coming down the chain from the chain of command or the hierarchy or the thing that's getting the attention from the customers. Boom, we focus on that. Everything else gets dropped. And we're perennially and forever chasing our tail and putting out spot fires. Yeah. The principle you got there is great, I think, which is around what's the thing that's going to pay off with the biggest value in the future. And I think you've used the phrase future time dividend. How does that come into it when you're bringing this argument to the table with leaders about where to choose to invest their effort? How do you highlight that point for them?
Yeah, look, it's one of the most common challenges that leaders and executives face. Time is our most valuable resource, and it's the one that we have the least of, right? With everything that's going on in our world these days, I think leaders that aren't intentional about stewarding their time well and making the most and of that and struggling with this challenge, they are reactive. As you said, it's the most urgent thing. They're reacting to the most urgent thing, was the latest email in their boxes, the latest thing that the bosses are. They're just reacting, and they're not proactive, right? That is the interesting that they're doing the thing that they don't want their people to do. And if you challenge it, it's like, well, do you want your people to react and be reactive, or do you want them to show initiative and be proactive and do things themselves? And they're always going to say the latter, but they're often doing the former. And so you're starting with an awareness of that's what they're doing, I think is where you start. And then it's, that the question that I asked, I remember very early on looking at a particular leader that I sat under, and he carried a massive capacity, or he had a massive capacity. He carried a massive workload. He had something like 7 or 8 portfolios that he was doing. And I just sat down, I said, how do you do it? Like you're across so many different things, and you don't seem to be dropping any balls. What's the secret to your success? And he looked at me and he said, the question that I ask myself all the time, every day, is what do I need to do now that's going to give me more time in 6 weeks or 6 months? And so often, whatever it is that you need to do to give you more time in the future is going to be inconvenient. It's going to require a sacrifice. It's not going to be the most urgent thing, but it's probably the most important thing. And so that's the question, I guess, that help you think and to identify what you need to do. And then it's a matter of when are you going to do it? When are you going to find the time to do it? And it's a conversation that is, I work with a number of clients and leaders who part of their role is very reactive, and they cannot change that. They have to be able to react and respond and deal with things that are unanticipated coming in. And I'm like, okay, cool. That's core to your role. You cannot change that. However, when do you do the proactive thinking and work? When do you do the strategic things that are going to actually not just keep your team afloat, but actually moving forward? And so trying to get leaders to carve out time in their schedules. It may be 2 hours a week, all right? Maybe a 90-minute block, whatever it is, but it's time where you say, hey, this is my strategic thinking time. And getting them to, obviously communicating that to everybody and, up the chain as well as, peer level and around, and saying, hey, this is what it is. I'm not going to be disturbed in this time. I'm going to be off email. My phone's going to be off, whatever the kind of logistics of that are. But you think this is the time for me to sit down, think about goals, develop strategy to achieve them. It might be to invest in people. It might be to do all those sorts of things. But unless you can clearly articulate what the strategic things that are required to move your team forward are, you can't be intentional about pursuing those. And that principle there, it really underpins all the work that I do. Unless you can clearly articulate it, you can't be intentional about actioning it. And I challenge leaders, find an area of your life where that does not apply. If you're going to be intentional about something, you've got to articulate what you're going to be intentional about. And if you're reactive all the time, then you're not moving things forward. You're not being proactive. You're not showing. You need the time to first think and articulate, and then actually go and pursue, right, and execute. So, helping leaders find that time and make it a priority and communicate that to everybody is often the starting point to them taking more control back in their life and their workplace so that they can move forward and achieve their goals.
I think that's a massive point you've raised there, Cliff, and I think it applies to people across the organisation. Coming out of defence myself in an aviation environment, flying C-17s before that, Seahawk helicopters, the piloting game, decision-making, crew management, all that, briefing, second nature. But now with a bigger team, the people management skills that some of my peers, maybe from Army or Air Force or Navy, from more of a command-orientated role, they had those naturally. I didn't. So, yeah, even for myself, going back, breaking those down, making time, and like you've said, pushing back on people and saying, no, I need time out to focus on this for these reasons, and setting that expectation. It's been huge. It's been massive.
Yeah. No, definitely. And you would know from the piloting game, talking to my brother as a pilot, he's like, you should never fly anywhere you haven't flown in your head first, right? It's that whole principle of chair flying and actually sitting down and preparing and doing all that. It's the same in the leadership game. You should never walk into a meeting without a plan, right? And so getting leaders to find the time to sit down and go, okay, what do I want out of this meeting? Who are the people around? What are their priorities? How do I articulate what I want them to do in a way that contributes to their priorities, so that they're getting what they want, so that they get me what I want, and the outcome and the purpose is all done, and everybody they want to be going in the same direction. If you haven't thought about that, you're walking in blind, right? And it's like walking on operations. You're walking and going on patrol without a map, and no intended course, and so you don't know where. You haven't thought about, well, what are the likely exfil routes? What are the likely points where we might get ambushed? What are the likely points the enemy might be? You've got to be intentional about those sort of scenarios. It's exactly the same in the leadership game. You've got to be intentional about, not just the battle space, but your workspace as well.
I found that so true, and particularly now, defence industry is similar enough to defence, but it's a civilian sphere. It's a different game. So for me, walking into a military context, I can generally know what to expect from anyone in the room in the military, give or take a bit of, different behaviour. Maybe people are struggling with things or someone's got an attitude concern. But you've got certain ranks, you've got certain job roles, and they typically perform pretty consistently. And that's something I'm sure is right up in your camp. But you step into the civilian world and, geez, you've got all sorts. The range of personalities and skill sets and attitudes are all over the show. So it's massive, it really is.
Yeah, and the thing is, what I find so many people in the civilian world, they don't know what good looks like. They've never actually sat under a really good leader. In the military, we get exposed to the whole spectrum of leadership. I say I've worked with some of the best leaders, and I happily follow them into battle and take a bullet for them. I've also worked with leaders that I gladly throw a grenade under their bed while they slept. Right? We get exposed to both good and bad. So often in the civilian sector, they hear about what good is, but they've never actually sat under and been led by a really good leader. And so therefore they are just replicating what they see, all right, which is potentially poor leadership practices. And when we think about, there's research out there that suggests there's 10 years between when someone gets their first supervisory responsibility to when they get their first high quality leadership training, which is a decade of, walking blind and kind of just making it up as you go along. And in a situation like that, what do? Well, you look to the people that are around you that are, have been leaders that you've sat under, but they're in the same situation that you're in because they haven't had the leadership training. So, and what ends up happening is all these bad habits get perpetuated. So I talk about warring against the perpetuation of poor leadership in the pursuit of developing leaders.
Great point, mate. And I think that's a pretty major frustration for many defence leavers going into teams that are maybe underperforming. Well, the leadership isn't what they experience in defence. That can be pretty unnerving.
Yeah, definitely. It's a big transition.
So, Cliff, tell me about your book you've released recently, The Coaching Leader, Essential Skills to Enhance Your Leadership and Develop Your People Every Day. Yeah,
so the book, look, it's a big journey to get this one out for anyone that has written a book. It's a bit of a roller coaster. Look, it's obviously in the work that I do in leadership development, I'm a big part of that is being an executive coach and doing executive coaching. And I've got a lot of experience in doing that. It's one of the things that I love doing that. Literally just before logging on here, I've come from a coaching session with a leader in the retail industry. And so the whole premise of the book, right, is to essentially equip leaders with coaching skills. When leaders have, I talk about in the book, right, one of the differences between good and great leaders is the ability to develop capability, not just to drive performance. And, given the background in aviation, I use the analogy of a captain and a first officer in the civilian airline industry. And I was talking to my brother, who is a first officer for Qantas. And he was saying that one of the differences between a great captain and a good versus a good captain is a good captain will ensure that the plane and the passengers get from A to B safely. Right, but they can do that in a way where they take full responsibility for that, and therefore they do the flying and ensure that everything is done right. And the first officer does very little; they're just there to support. He would say that a great captain, the best flying experiences as a first officer, is where the captain takes that responsibility seriously, but lets the first officer do all the flying or as much of it as possible so that they get the experience that they need to become a future captain. And in that way, the captain there is leading and supervising and empowering and elevating the first officer, and therefore developing the captain's capability, I guess, across the airline in the way that he executes his responsibility of getting the aircraft and the passengers from A to B safely. And so, I'm a big believer that yes, leaders they have a primary responsibility to drive performance and lead people and achieve goals in their organizations, whatever they are. But they have this secondary one that not a lot of leaders don't focus on, and that's to do that, to achieve the performance in a way that develops the people that they lead and transforms them into better versions of themselves. So for me, the most effective mechanism to do that is actually coaching and coaching skills. Now, I think what I've tried to do in this book is really say, this is how you use coaching skills to enhance your leadership. I'm not trying to create more executive coaches. I don't want to fill our organizations with a bunch of coaches, because we'd just be talking about things and focus on developing people rather than actually getting things done. We need leaders to lead, to make decisions, to drive performance and get things done. But my big belief is that when leaders have a coaching skill set as part of their leadership toolkit, anything that they do as a leader is an opportunity to be turned into a development opportunity for your people, right? It's an opportunity to develop people. And so literally any task, and I'll put this to certain leaders, it's like, well, what do you have to do? Well, hey, if you've got coaching skills, you can bring someone alongside them, do it with them, and you coach them through it. And that's it. If you've got a strategic decision to make, that's your decision to make. Turn it into an opportunity to develop people. You say, hey, Sally, come on into my office. I've got the decision to make. I could go this way, I could go that way. Not really sure. I'd love to bounce that off you. You know, given the context, what decision would you make? And, you know, okay, so what are you trying to achieve? What's the outcome there? Tell me about your thinking. What are the key considerations that you're making? So coaching is strategic questioning, right? In a nutshell. And so you're asking these strategic questions to coach her through making this decision, you know, and at the end of that, you say, hey, Sally, thank you so much for the, you know, this conversation. Still not sure where I'm going to go. I haven't made my decision yet. But I feel like I've worked through it and are a little bit clearer now. So thank you very much. You think about the impact on Sally, because she comes in and she's like, wow, I must be doing well, because the boss he's invited me, he values my opinion, right? If I'm a low performer, he's not going to value my opinion, my contribution to this decision. So I must be doing well for him to want that. So you're building up their self-belief, their self-efficacy. You're also exposing her to your role. You're developing her strategic thinking, because she's now thinking about all these different things that you have to think about. You know, you're asking, well, what about the consideration here? How would that be perceived over there? What might be the second, third, fourth order effects of that decision there? And all of a sudden she's, you know, rather than operating at her level, she's now thinking about all of this. And that's a massive part of the development process. But she also gets experience of what it's like to make decisions at your level. And, you know, in the military, we get that all the time. It's the one-up training. It's, you know, you go on exercise and, you know, your section commander or leader, whoever, whatever rank they are off doing a promotion course. And so you've got to step up into that role and you have to lead the team, and you get exposed to all that. That doesn't happen in the civilian world. Again, it's one of those things that's normal in the military, but it's not normal in the civilian world. So she's getting this one-up training and exposure to the next level. And so that's all the benefit to her. You think about the benefit to you. Well, one, you now know where she's at from a development perspective. You know where her gaps are, and what you can focus on to help her develop. You kind of get an understanding of the perception of your team and the people at lower levels. So you got a greater understanding of what the implications of different courses of action might be for this decision. And also you get clarity yourself, because one of the things when you coach people is that you coach people on a particular issue, you learn so much and get so much clarity yourself on that particular issue. So you can then go and make a much more informed decision out of there. So you've had a decision to make. It's your decision to make. Most leaders would sit down in their office and do some hard thinking and do all that. But if you've got a coaching skill set, you pulled someone in and you develop them in the process of making that decision yourself. And again, that might take 20 minutes, all right? It might slow down your decision making. But I tell you what, in 6 months' time, when Sally is faced with a decision herself, she can actually make that decision and come in and say, hey, boss, here's the scenario. I've done all this. I've thought about this consideration, that consideration, these effects on the different course of action, and I've made this decision. Here's what we're doing. And you can sit back and go, that's brilliant. I don't have to spend any mental energy or time figuring out what to do in that thing. She's done it all herself. And so, it's kind of going a bit full circle there in some of the things that we're talking about. You've made a better decision yourself. It's helped you, but you've developed her. And now, as a result, you've got more time because you've developed the capability in that individual in your team. So, I've tried to say, here's a bunch of coaching skills. Here's a bunch of scenarios, everyday scenarios that you as a leader will encounter, and here's how you can apply them to enhance your leadership, develop your people, end up getting a better outcome for your people. So that's the book, really.
Awesome, Cliff. And I think there's no better example of time dividend, how to put time in now to achieve an outcome in the future, than what you've just outlined in terms of growing your people. If you're a leader or a young up-and-comer, no better example. So, yeah, brilliant book, brilliant work, mate.
Yeah.
So
I was just going to say, Matt, if you really want to see a brilliant example of that in play, read the book Turn the Ship Around by David Marquet, where he essentially has to take command of a submarine that he knows nothing about the operations of. And that submarine was the lowest performing one in the US Navy and ended up becoming the highest performing ship in the US Navy naval history. And essentially it was that process kind of on a bigger scale that did that. So it's a great story, really easy read, brilliant book that I recommend to all leaders. But really kind of takes what I just described through on a bigger level.
Yeah, thanks, Cliff. I have heard of that one. Haven't read it yet, but it's certainly on the list.
Make sure you do.
So, mate, where can people reach out and touch base if they want to enlist your services or learn more about you?
Yeah, look, so my website, cliffordmorgan.com, is a great place, .com.au, cliffordmorgan.com.au, don't forget the AU. If you go there, that's probably the best place to find out a little bit more about me. You can purchase the book there. What I really love for a lot of people, if you're interested in what we've talked about, if you go there, there's the opportunity for you to download a coaching quick start guide. And that's really just, rather than reading the book, which goes into a whole lot of detail, you download that one and you can literally read that and 10 minutes later go and start coaching people. And it's got a bunch of questions, a bit of outline of the process, or you could give it to your leaders or some of your team so that they can go and start coaching and doing it that way. So cliffordmorgan.com.au is a great place to start. I'm also really active on LinkedIn, and I'd love to I'd love for your listeners to jump online and kind of send me a message, connect with me and send me a message and say, hey, love the podcast. Here's what really stood out to me and what resonated. Always get a kick out of those conversations. So, those website, LinkedIn, that's probably the best place to start.
Thanks, Cliff, and really appreciate you coming on. I think your journey from Air Force and how you methodically targeted the things you needed to do, whether that was conscious or picked up along the way, and then your experience throughout your career in psychology has been really instrumental. And I think, a handful of great lessons there for all our listeners in the audience.
Thanks, Matt. Really enjoyed the opportunity to have a chat today. It's been good.
Thanks, Cliff. Take care.
You too.
Okay, that's the episode with Clifford Morgan, Director of Lumian Consulting. You can find him on LinkedIn or at lumian.com.au. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you for your time and joining us once again, and I look forward to speaking with you soon.